Hey there, sleepless rabble. Why don't you lean back, close your eyes, and let me take over for a while? Tonight we're heading to Los Angeles, 1947. That's right, the land of palm trees, movie premieres, and big Hollywood dreams, but also the place where those dreams have a nasty habit of ending up in the gutter. This story is one of the most infamous cold cases in American history. A young woman came to Hollywood with hopes of stardom and instead became a headline, a mystery, and a ghost that still lingers over Los Angeles. They called her the Black Dahlia, a name that sounds glamorous, like a perfume ad, until you remember it was invented by journalists desperate to sell papers about a brutal crime. Because nothing screams Hollywood quite like turning tragedy into entertainment. Over the next hour, I'll take you through the City of Angels, the discovery that shocked the neighborhood, the investigation that made the LAPD look like amateurs, and the endless theories that kept the case alive for nearly 80 years. But don't worry, this isn't a police report. This is a sleep story. So we'll glide through the dark alleys of 1940s Los Angeles slowly, with a bit of dry humor, a touch of irony, and just enough mystery to keep you awake until you drift off. Before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and support us over at ko-fi.com/napmax. It helps keep the lights on, or at least the microphone humming. And here's tonight's question for you. We want to know where you're tuning in from. Write the name of your city down in the comments. Let's see how far the Black Dahlia's shadow reaches. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to Boring Murder for Sleep, The Black Dahlia. Let's begin. Los Angeles, January 1947. The city likes to call itself the capital of dreams, though most of those dreams have the lifespan of a cigarette stub on the pavement. The weather is free advertising. Blue skies, light jackets in winter, and just enough sunshine to convince newcomers that everything will work out. It rarely does. Hollywood is not built on happy endings. It is built on auditions that never get called back, on agents who never answer the phone, on bus tickets that only work one way. Lymert Park is not the glamorous postcard of Los Angeles. It is tidy, middle class, almost boring. Perfect camouflage for a story that would soon become legend. The morning of January 15th begins in the usual way. Milk trucks clattering, radios muttering swing tunes, neighbors discussing rationing as if it had only ended yesterday. Housewives write shopping lists, men fold newspapers, and children drag their feet to school. Nothing screams history in the making. And then there is Betty Berzinger, out with a pram. She's not looking for headlines. She's looking for fresh air and perhaps bread later on. As she passes a vacant lot, her eyes catch on something pale in the grass. Her mind supplies the most reasonable option, a mannequin tossed from a department store. Los Angeles is littered with broken illusions. Mannequins are just one more. But the figure looks too deliberate, too staged. Betty slows, frowns, and then, with the instinct of someone who has seen enough of life to know when it turns ugly, she hurries away. A phone call later, and the neighborhood is no longer boring. Police arrive with sirens that sound both urgent and embarrassed, as if apologizing for being late. They attempt to secure the area, though the concept of a crime scene in 1947 is more suggestion than rule. Neighbors press forward, children crane their necks, and reporters materialize almost instantly. Notebooks at the ready. If Los Angeles has a native bird, it is the journalist who flocks at the scent of tragedy. The officers go through the motions, photographs, sketches, half-hearted attempts at order. The staging of the scene is unnerving. Too clean, too deliberate. Not an accident, not a quarrel gone wrong, but something done with time and skill. Whoever was responsible wanted attention, and they got it. The crowd mutters theories before the detectives can finish their notes. A starlet fallen from grace, a runaway punished by fate, a wife abandoned by loyalty. Los Angeles has a dictionary of cliches for women, and it recycles them quickly. Reporters begin drafting copy in their heads, already considering which adjectives will sell papers without making readers choke on breakfast. Neighbors treat the lot like cheap entertainment. Some whisper with the solemnity of churchgoers, others point as if comparing drapery. A boy sneaks closer until his mother yanks him back by the collar. A salesman insists he saw a dark sedan idling last night, though it might just as easily have been a bus. Someone else swears the dog barked longer than usual. By evening, half the block will have convinced itself it had front row seats to the crime. Detectives, meanwhile, care about one thing above all: identity. They need a name. Without it, there is no case, only spectacle. But this is 1947. No DNA, no instant databases. Just fingerprints on cards, mailed across the country, to be matched by clerks who spend their days squinting at ink smudges. It is tedious, slow, and the only method they have. Around the lot, the neighborhood becomes theater. A man insists he heard a car in the night. Another swears he saw headlights after midnight. A boy claims he noticed 2 shadows, though under pressure, it becomes 3. A woman reports that the streetlight flickered. All of it is written down because sometimes the dullest details become the string that unravels the knot. More often, they are simply dull. The press, however, does not wait for certainty. They christen the unknown woman with a name borrowed from a recent film. A name that sounds glamorous, almost alluring, which is exactly why it will stick. In Los Angeles, branding is more durable than truth. Detectives continue with their list of tasks: collect prints, interview neighbors, chase false leads. Each form filled, each item tagged, is an attempt to impose order on a situation that resists it. But the scene itself whispers something darker. This was done by someone who knew what they were doing, and who wanted the city to know it too. As the day stretches on, the sun grows harsher, shadows shrink, tempers rise, crowds disperse only to be replaced by new onlookers. Photographers argue about the best angle, though in truth, there is no good angle. Editors demand copy that balances horror with breakfast table digestibility. It is the kind of civic ritual that Los Angeles performs with unsettling skill, turning tragedy into narrative by nightfall. Evening arrives. Street lamps flicker on, radios announce baseball scores, as if the city has agreed to pretend everything is normal. But the lot on Norton Avenue refuses to play along. Officers rotate shifts, a sergeant rubs his temples, and somewhere downtown, a clerk stamps urgent on a file that will travel slower than rumor. The case is now alive, and it will not sleep again. But for this first day, it balances on a single question. Unglamorous, yet essential. Who is she? The city craves spectacle, but the detectives know better. Before motives, before suspects, before myths, they need a name. The Los Angeles Police Department liked to pretend it was ready for anything. Bank robberies, drunk brawls on Bunker Hill, the occasional missing husband who turned out to be very found at another woman's apartment. Those they could handle. But a carefully staged corpse in a vacant lot, with half the city and the entire press corps circling like sharks, that was a different category of headache. The very first problem was simple on paper. Who was she? Not what had been done to her, not why it was done, just the basic fact of identity. Until they had a name, the rest was noise. Unfortunately, 1947 was not the future. There were no computer databases to spit out answers, no DNA samples run through machines that beep comfortingly. There were just fingerprints, cards, ink, and overworked clerks squinting under fluorescent lights in Washington, D.C. So the detectives got to work. They dusted, lifted, pressed, and mailed. Yes, mailed. Imagine trying to solve a murder with the efficiency of the postal service. Days could be lost to envelopes, to stamps, to some underpaid civil servant deciding lunch was more important than homicide. But that was the system, and they had no alternative. While the prince travelled east, the reporters were busy doing what they did best, filling in blanks with confidence. By the time the newspapers hit the stands, the unknown woman had been elevated from tragedy to icon. They dubbed her the Black Dahlia, a name stolen from a film title, polished with a bit of tabloid glamour, and pinned to a real human being who no longer had the luxury of disagreeing. Branding came before biography. That's Los Angeles efficiency. At the precinct, detectives flipped through missing person reports. Young women went missing all the time in this city. Some ran away from small towns, chasing their names and lights. Some vanished into cheap apartments and cheaper relationships. A few simply moved on and forgot to notify anyone back home. Sorting through these files was like trying to match puzzle pieces from 5 different boxes, most of them missing corners. Leads began to trickle in. One caller insisted she recognized the woman from a diner in Hollywood. Another swore the face belonged to a girl who used to dance downtown. Tips piled up faster than they could be checked, each more insistent than the last. Los Angeles residents suddenly remembered dozens of encounters with mysterious brunettes. Because everyone wants a footnote in history, especially when history is gruesome enough to sell breakfast papers. The detectives, jaded though they were, understood the importance of caution. Every time the press splashed another wild theory, neighbors swore it was true. Facts became optional, and once they circulated, they were impossible to kill. Rumors have longer lives than witnesses. Behind closed doors, the LAPD worked with the only weapon it had left: patience. They needed Washington to send back a match, a tiny slip of paper with a name on it. That would turn a spectacle into a case file. Until then, they endured the circus outside. The reporters demanding statements, the editors baying for copy, the neighbors who suddenly remembered seeing a suspicious shadow around 2 in the morning. Shadows are remarkably punctual in these stories. When the identification finally came, it didn't arrive with fanfare. No dramatic music, no cinematic reveal, just a telegram and a quiet conversation in an office with a fan that squeaked every 3rd rotation. The woman had a history, a home, a life before she became a headline. She was not born to be a mystery, but Los Angeles was already making her one. The detectives now had a name to attach to the vacant lot discovery, and with that name came the obligation to learn everything about her. Family, friends, lovers, ambitions, who she met, where she went, what she wanted. Only by understanding her life could they hope to understand her death. Of course, this was Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, the truth never enters the stage without its understudies. Gossip, exaggeration, and lies, told so often they start to sound like facts. The case was still young, the press still hungry, and the city still whispering. The investigators were about to discover that solving a murder in Hollywood was less about evidence and more about navigating a studio backlot of illusions. And so, while the clerks filed the name away, the detectives prepared for the next act. Pulling apart her past, piece by piece, until they understood how a young woman's story ended in a vacant lot under the indifferent California sun. The telegram arrived with no fanfare, no swelling music, no crowd of reporters leaning over typewriters to capture the words. Just a slip of paper, delivered with the efficiency of government bureaucracy, late, unglamorous, but final. The fingerprints matched. The nameless woman from Norton Avenue had an identity now, and the investigation could move from guessing game to biography. Her name was Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, a young woman from the East Coast who had traveled west chasing the same mirage as countless others. Hollywood. For the detectives, it was progress. For the city, it was raw material. Elizabeth wasn't born a mystery, though Los Angeles would insist on turning her into one. She was born in Boston in 1924, the third of 5 daughters. A household full of noise, arguments, and rationed space. Her father abandoned the family during the Depression. One day he was there. The next day his car was found abandoned on a bridge. Suicide was assumed, though he later reappeared very much alive. The 1930s were hard enough without fake widowers, but the Short family got one anyway. Elizabeth's mother scraped by, raising the girls with the brittle optimism of someone who could not afford despair. Elizabeth, the pretty one, learned early that her looks earned her attention. Neighbors called her beautiful. Boys circled like moths. And she discovered the strange currency of being noticed. In a decade where dentistry was optional and orthodontics practically science fiction, she stood out. Dark hair, pale skin, striking features. Hollywood would have called it marketable. As a teenager, Elizabeth struggled with asthma and fragile health, which sent her south to Medford, Massachusetts, and later to Miami during the winters. Sunshine was prescribed as medicine, and she carried it like a lifeline. Florida gave her a taste of something brighter than Boston winters. Palm trees, white sand, and the idea that life could be glamorous if you stood in the right light. But glamour was rationed, even in Florida. The war years arrived, and like so many young women of the 1940s, Elizabeth navigated a world reshaped by uniforms and departures. She dated soldiers, wrote letters, and wore dresses sharp enough to catch glances at dancers. She cultivated the look of a starlet without the paycheck to match it. In photographs, she often tilted her chin upward, as if already auditioning for the spotlight. By the mid-1940s, she drifted west. California had a magnetic pull on girls like her. A promise whispered in movie magazines, in newsreels, in stories carried back from boys stationed at training bases. Los Angeles was selling the idea that the next Joan Crawford or Rita Hayworth could be discovered at a soda fountain. Elizabeth believed it. Why not? Somebody had to be chosen, and maybe it would be her. She wasn't a studio contract, but she dressed like she could be one. Black dresses, tailored coats, high heels on sidewalks that ate shoes for breakfast. Friends would later remember her as dramatic, sometimes mysterious, often broke, always stylish. She worked odd jobs, waitressing, clerical work, but her ambition was not to balance ledgers or carry trays. She wanted the screen. Hollywood, of course, wanted thousands of Elizabeth Shorts, all competing for the same narrow beam of light. By 1946, she was living in Los Angeles proper, renting rooms, borrowing couches, moving frequently. The city chewed through dreamers faster than it printed movie posters. Elizabeth moved through Hollywood Boulevard like an extra waiting to be promoted. Visible but replaceable. She dated, she danced, she cultivated connections. To some, she seemed exciting. To others, she seemed adrift. Both assessments were correct. For the police, this biography was more than background. It was potential motive. Every detail of her life now became evidence, or at least material to be bent into evidence. Her lovers, her friends, her addresses, her ambitions, all of it mattered. And yet, behind the paperwork and interviews, there was still a young woman with the simple desire to matter in a city built on ignoring people. When the LAPD announced her name, the press wasted no time. Elizabeth Short was now the Black Dahlia, in bold type, a brand stronger than her actual life. Reporters scrambled to track down anyone who had spoken to her, danced with her, or even glimpsed her in a bar. Some described her as sweet, others as aloof, still others as a schemer. The truth was probably mundane, but mundane never sells. The press preferred mystery, scandal, and a nickname that sounded like a film noir premiere. Her story was only just being written for the public, but for detectives, the work shifted into higher gear. Now that they had a name, they could begin chasing her footsteps, where she had been in the final days, who she had seen, what promises were made, what dangers she didn't recognize. And so, the vacant lot mystery had transformed. The faceless figure now had a life, a family, and a trail to follow. The next step for investigators was to rewind her last days in Los Angeles, one fragile connection at a time. Because in Hollywood, everyone claims to know someone. And suddenly, everyone knew Elizabeth Short. The name made the city bolder. Once the papers printed it, strangers discovered astonishing memories. They had seen her everywhere, on streetcars, in cafes, leaning against jukeboxes, laughing in doorways that didn't exist last week. Some swore she asked for a light. Others insisted she never touched cigarettes. Los Angeles is generous with recollection, especially when recollection can get its picture in the paper. The police tried to separate a life from its echo. They started with the solid pieces: rooms rented under her own name, letters kept in borrowed drawers, a bus stub here, a diner tab there. In the last weeks of 1946, she'd been in San Diego, living softly at the edges of someone else's routine, helping with a child, stretching dollars, wearing her best dress more often than the fabric preferred. When she needed a ride back north, a salesman obliged. The city has always been full of men happy to play chaperone, as long as the part includes applause. That ride delivered her to downtown Los Angeles on a cool evening in January. The Biltmore made a convenient waiting room, warm lobby, deep chairs, bellhops with opinions. She said she was meeting someone. The lobby, being a lobby, refused to confirm or deny. The salesman left, the way decent men do when they want to stay on the right side of decent. After that, the night fractures into statements and guesswork. One clerk thought she headed toward Olive Street. A doorman remembered the coat, but not the face. Memory, as usual, preserved the wrong details. There were sightings, of course there were. A bar off 7th, a cafe near Main, a rooming house where the landlady could describe any girl in Los Angeles in flattering light. Some claimed she drifted through the Crown Grill. Some placed her near a movie house where the usher swore on his paycheck he saw her twice. None of it came with proof sturdy enough to lean on. The detectives took it all and filed it in the drawer labeled maybe. Throughout those days, she did what young women do when the rent clock is louder than the radio. Visit friends, borrow a sofa, promise to come back with news. She was good at promising. Hollywood requires that skill. A neighbor remembered her laugh as bright but careful. The sound of someone testing how much room she's allowed to take up. Another remembered she walked quickly, as if hurrying to catch up with the look that kept missing her stop. Money was thin. Calls were made from lobbies where calls were cheaper. Coffee was stretched by the conversation. Meals were strategized the way generals plan retreats. She wore black not because the papers told her to, but because it was practical and photographic, and turned 2 dresses into 4. She kept company with men who liked to talk big. She listened like a person who understands that attention is a kind of currency, and that you spend it carefully or not at all. If there was danger in those last days, it didn't introduce itself. It arrived politely, under ordinary lighting, in sentences that sounded like the future. Meet me later, I know a director, there's a party in the hills. The city breathes those lines, and newcomers keep believing them because sometimes they're true just long enough to ruin your instincts. Friends would later say she was choosy or trusting, or neither, depending on what made the best story. The truth, inconveniently, sits in between. Detectives retraced her footsteps on paper. They drew lines between addresses, then discarded the map when it began to resemble every other map of every other hopeful girl. They interviewed bartenders, priests of the confessional with worse hours, who remembered smiles and not names. They listened to landladies who remembered names and not dates. They called cousins and former, roommates and boys who said they were more than that. The picture that emerged was precise in the wrong places. We know the shape of the days, but not the face in the doorway. The press did its part to help by making everything louder. Headlines implied she lived a double life. Columns suggested secrets because secrets read better than errands. If she went missing for a night, it must have been intrigue, never a missed streetcar or a friend who forgot to answer the door. The city decided she was a riddle, and riddles attract solvers with varying credentials. Some leads had weight. A woman swore Elizabeth shared a room for a stretch, spent evenings reading magazines, talked about getting pictures taken. The dates half-matched, which is a Los Angeles kind of match. A clerk produced a note, maybe hers, maybe not, with a number that rang unanswered. A cabbie thought he'd taken her to a street where the houses always look surprised to be there. A waitress remembered she tipped even when she shouldn't have. These are the sorts of truths that never make the front page. Small, human, stubborn. By the Friday before the discovery, her trail developed the familiar gaps of a life without a fixed address. No paychecks to plot on a calendar, no clock-in sheet to testify under oath. Just acquaintances with fragmentary impressions. She seemed excited. She seemed tired. She said tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow in this town is a professional liar. The detectives tried imagination carefully, the way surgeons handle sharp things. Suppose someone invited her somewhere. Suppose the invitation came from a person who spoke fluent promise. Suppose she followed, because that's how you move forward here. They checked doctors' offices and casting agencies, cheap hotels with registers that learned to spell carelessly. They looked for a name that'd start to hide. Meanwhile, letters were posted to people back east, who had the right to be told first and the least chance of believing it. The replies would take days, and the days would not behave. In station houses and squad cars, theories rose and fell with the hour. A professional? A jealous lover? Something random and ugly? The only steady answer was the one no one wanted. We don't know yet. In interviews, friends painted her as complicated in the way ordinary people are complicated. Warm and wary, practical and theatrical. She didn't have a temper, except when she did. She trusted easily, except when she didn't. The city prefers archetypes, angel or schemer, saint or siren, because archetypes fit in columns. The detectives, bored with archetypes, kept asking for times and places. If there was a last safe room, a last cup of coffee, A last laugh that didn't know it was last. The record fails to preserve it. What survives are pieces. The lobby where she waited. The bar where someone might have seen her. The sidewalk where her heels clicked too quickly for anyone to catch up. The pattern suggests a familiar problem. A young woman with limited money, social gravity pulling her between addresses, attention arriving with strings attached. And then the timeline stops behaving. There's a blank, a night that refuses to testify, a silence that acts like a witness who's found a better story. Out of that blank, the discovery arrives, and everything that came before is reinterpreted as foreshadowing by people who love neat arcs. But the last days of a life are rarely neat. They are messy with errands and phone calls, with hope and impatience, with choices that look harmless until someone points to them later with a ruler. For the investigators, the task ahead was ugly in a procedural way. Pull the thread of those final movements until it snags on a name that isn't hers. Because somewhere in that week, between the lobby and the bar, between borrowed couches and borrowed time, someone else's orbit crossed hers with intent. Tomorrow, the file would open to colder pages, examinations, timings, the quiet arithmetic of harm. Names would enter the frame, men with credentials and men with charm, and a city prepared to believe both. The body was moved to the county morgue, that unglamorous backstage where Hollywood's promises are stripped down to paperwork and linoleum floors. Here, under the hum of fluorescent lights, the performance ended and the arithmetic began. Doctors in white coats didn't care about headlines or nicknames. They cared about time of death, cause, and the sequence of injuries that turned a person into a file. The autopsy spoke in the language of blunt facts. The public would later be fed only a curated version, just enough horror to sell newspapers, but not enough to upset breakfast entirely. Detectives, though, got the full accounting. What they learned confirmed what they had suspected at the scene. This was not random, not quick, and not the work of an amateur. Whoever had done this had patience, skill, and a flair for presentation. It was a double-edged discovery. On one hand, it meant the case was serious, complex, and perhaps solvable. On the other, it suggested they were dealing with someone who had rehearsed. A person who knew how to hurt without hurry, and who might have enjoyed leaving a signature behind. The LAPD, not known for subtlety, now found themselves chasing someone who treated murder like stage design. The detectives gathered in smoky rooms, debating what kind of killer would go to such lengths. A doctor, a surgeon, a butcher with an eye for symmetry. Names were tossed around like poker chips. The trouble with Los Angeles is that it had plenty of all three, and most of them had alibis rehearsed before the police even asked. The press, meanwhile, was drunk on detail. Each leak, each whispered phrase from inside the department, became a headline. The words gruesome and ghastly had their busiest week in decades. Some reporters embroidered the facts until the victim seemed less like a person and more like a gothic character in a cheap paperback. The line between information and imagination grew faint, and the public devoured it eagerly. With the autopsy in hand, the detectives turned back to Elizabeth Short's final days. The Biltmore Hotel sighting became a pivot point. Who was she waiting for? The hotel staff remembered a young woman, stylish in black, pacing the lobby. After that, nothing. She vanished into the Los Angeles night, as countless hopefuls did. Except hers would not end with a casting call. Suspects began to multiply, as they always do in cases where the victim had a social orbit and a city eager to gossip. Lovers past and present, acquaintances, men who claimed intimacy after a single handshake. Detectives tracked them down one by one, scribbling notes, gauging reactions, looking for inconsistencies. Some were dismissive, some defensive, some suddenly religious. None confessed. The early favourites included doctors, men with surgical skill, access to instruments, and perhaps too much free time after the war. A surgeon who had been drinking too much, a medical student with odd habits, a local physician known for arrogance. Each fit a piece of the theory. None fit all of it. Interrogations stretched into the night, but the evidence never sealed the deal. Then came the letters. Reporters received envelopes written in neat block handwriting, claiming a responsibility, taunting police, promising more revelations. The killer, or someone who enjoyed impersonating him, fed the media with scraps. Personal belongings of Elizabeth, notes signed with theatrical flourish. The LAPD panicked. The newspapers gloated. It was proof, if any were needed, that the case had left the realm of police procedure and entered the circus. The public lapped it up. Housewives speculated at grocery counters. Taxi drivers traded theories between fares. Children on playgrounds whispered the Black Dahlia's name as if it were a ghost story. The city that sold illusions had birthed a new one, darker and more durable than any studio picture. For detectives, the frustration grew. Each suspect examined, each lead tested, ended in the same place. Nowhere. The autopsy had confirmed the skill of the killer, but not his identity. The letters thrilled the press, but complicated the trail. And through it all, the memory of Elizabeth Short herself risked being swallowed by the myth. The case was no longer just about catching a killer. It was about outpacing the narrative that the city had already chosen to believe. And narratives, once loose in Los Angeles, are harder to kill than suspects. By the end of January, Los Angeles looked less like a city and more like an audition room where everyone thought they had the lead. The press wanted a culprit. The LAPD wanted a miracle. The public wanted a bedtime story with a villain they could point to. The result was a parade of suspects so long it might have required ushers and ticket stubs. The police files thickened with names. Doctors, bartenders, actors between roles, servicemen fresh out of uniforms, married men who weren't where they said they were. Anyone with a sharp instrument and a flexible alibi suddenly found themselves interesting to the LAPD. The case was like a mirror held up to the city. Anyone could see themselves reflected if they squinted. The first cluster of attention fell, predictably, on men with surgical skill. The crime scene suggested precision, and the detectives were not subtle about their assumptions. Surgeons, medical students, and even butchers came under the lamp. One physician, known for arrogance and a fondness for whiskey, found himself interrogated until his patients snapped louder than his answers. Another, a student, was scrutinized mostly because he seemed nervous in general. In truth, most of Los Angeles seemed nervous. It was a nervous kind of city. Then there were the romantic connections, a polite term for the revolving cast of men who circled Elizabeth Short in the weeks and months before her death. Soldiers on leave, salesmen with promises, would-be actors with less charm than confidence. Each of them was summoned, questioned, sometimes grilled for hours. All denied knowledge, most looked guilty simply because guilt was fashionable in interrogation rooms. Yet, nothing stuck. The press made things worse, as usual. Headlines trumpeted each new suspect as if the case were solved, only to retreat into vagueness the next day. Surgeon held in Dahlia case, actor quizzed in murder mystery, police grill ex-soldier. It was a daily carnival of half-truths. designed less to inform than to keep readers hooked between cigarette ads and the baseball scores. The LAPD even received confessions, dozens of them. Some came from drifters who wanted a hot meal and a bed in exchange for a dramatic story. Others came from the chronically bored, eager to be part of the city's biggest performance. A few were chillingly detailed, but always just slightly off. The detectives learned quickly that Los Angeles contained not just dreamers, but liars with Broadway ambitions. Among the more memorable suspects was a man who wrote letters boasting of his guilt, sending Elizabeth's belongings to prove his authenticity. The handwriting was neat, the tone theatrical, the signature absurdly formal. Detectives hoped they had found their man, but the trail fizzled once again. The letters were real. The killer was still hypothetical. Behind the headlines, the investigation slogged. Detectives retraced Elizabeth's final days over and over, testing timelines until they wore thin. They interviewed hotel clerks, bartenders, landladies, and friends of friends of friends. They chased leads from San Diego to San Francisco, only to circle back empty-handed. For every suspect who was cleared, 2 more emerged from the fog. And always the public demanded answers. Housewives at markets swapped theories like recipes. Taxi drivers debated motives at red lights. Children dared each other to walk past the Norton Avenue lot after dark. The Black Dahlia had become less a person than a civic pastime, a macabre story the city told itself in between movies. The detectives knew the danger of this atmosphere. A case built on gossip can never close properly. Yet they also knew that silence would be worse, so the LAPD kept producing names, and the papers kept printing them. One week, the killer was a doctor, the next, an actor, the next, a stranger who had vanished into the desert. The city was chasing shadows, and the shadows were winning. By February, the investigation was drowning in suspects. Each new theory collided with the old ones, leaving nothing but confusion and column inches. The truth, if it was hiding among them, remained unimpressed. And in the middle of this whirlwind, Elizabeth Short herself risked vanishing again. Buried not in the earth this time, but under the weight of too many suspects, too many theories, too many versions of her life told by people who never really knew her. The case was no closer to being solved. But Los Angeles, always hungry for spectacle, had found something almost as satisfying as justice. An endless cast of possible villains, each more colourful than the last. By February, the Black Dahlia case had more suspects than Hollywood had screenwriters, which was saying something. But amid the blur of bartenders, ex-boyfriends, and men whose only crime was owning a sharp knife, a handful of names stood out. They weren't just suspects, they were characters, each with enough eccentricities to keep the city entertained while the police flailed. Take Dr. George Hoddle, for example. Wealthy physician, house in Hollywood designed by Lloyd Wright, reputation equal parts brilliance and arrogance. He had the surgical skill to fit the detective's favorite theory and the personality to make everyone uncomfortable at parties. Later investigators would whisper his name as if it were a curse, pointing to his history of scandals, shady dealings, and a household that could have doubled as a Gothic novel. At the time, though, the LAPD treated him with the mixture of suspicion and deference reserved for powerful men. He was questioned, of course, but never charged. Money and reputation act as very polite bodyguards. Then there was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner with a taste for young women and the power to hand out opportunities, real or imagined, in the entertainment world. Elizabeth had crossed paths with him. She'd even stayed at his house for a time. When detectives asked why, Hansen gave the kind of answers that sounded plausible enough, but never satisfying. He admitted she rebuffed his advances, and suddenly everyone wondered if rejection was motive. Convenient theory, messy proof. Hansen remained on the suspect list, his name forever attached to the case whether he deserved it or not. Hollywood had no shortage of men who enjoyed being important in Elizabeth's orbit, however briefly. Each was questioned, each gave conflicting stories, and each was eventually released. The file swelled, the mystery deepened, and the newspapers wrote profiles as if these men were auditioning for villain roles in a noir picture. Which, in a sense, they were. There were stranger suspects too. Men who confessed with suspicious enthusiasm. Men who wrote letters in clipped block capitals. Men who simply fit the public's idea of creepy. One drifter confessed, then recanted, then confessed again, depending on the mood of his interrogators. Another mailed in a confession from out of state, hoping for extradition, as if Los Angeles jails were somehow more glamorous. The sheer absurdity of it all blurred the line between investigation and performance. Detectives, exhausted, joked that the only person in Los Angeles not suspected was the mayor. And even that might change if the press got bored. Reporters painted every suspect in broad strokes. The jealous lover, the sinister doctor, the mysterious stranger. Archetypes are easier to print than complexities, and easier to consume with a morning coffee. The deeper problem was that none of these names came with evidence solid enough to hold in court. Rumors, innuendo, vague timelines, and suspicious personalities, yes. Physical proof, no. The LAPD found itself performing an endless dance. Announce a suspect, interrogate him, watch the case collapse, and start again. Each cycle left the public more convinced the city was harboring a criminal mastermind, and the police were just extras fumbling in the background. Still, certain figures would linger long after others faded. Hoddle, Hansen, the anonymous letter writer, each became woven into the legend. Books decades later would resurrect them like old ghosts, waving around theories dressed as revelations. But in 1947, they were simply men sitting in interrogation rooms, smoking too much, denying everything, and occasionally smirking when the detectives lost patience. The Black Dahlia case was no closer to resolution, but it was certainly entertaining. Los Angeles, a city built on casting calls, now had a rogues gallery of suspects, each more colourful than the last. And as the weeks stretched into months, the case shifted from immediate horror to enduring spectacle. The victim had been turned into a nickname, the crime into a puzzle, and the suspects into characters. And somewhere in that blur, the real killer stayed quiet, watching a city trip over itself to tell the story for him. By spring of 1947, the Black Dahlia case had stopped being a police investigation and started being Los Angeles' favorite performance. The city had found its new blockbuster, tragic, glamorous, and conveniently unsolved. Detectives still carried files and typed reports, but in the public's imagination, the case was already a movie, part noir thriller, part horror picture, with a cast of villains and a heroine who never got to deliver her final line. The newspapers kept the show alive with gusto. Every headline was written as if it were the climax, every photograph cropped to suggest mystery. Editors learned quickly that Unsolved sold better than solved. A murder with an ending is yesterday's news. A murder without one can be stretched across months of column inches. It was journalism as serial drama, and the city read along as faithfully as if it were a soap opera. Hollywood itself could hardly resist. The victim was already branded the Black Dahlia, a name stolen from a film polished by gossip, and now inseparable from the girl who once walked across lobbies in borrowed heels. The name turned her into a symbol, a tragic starlet who never made it. Onto the screen, but who achieved a kind of fame no studio could orchestrate. Actresses auditioned for roles while reporters wrote copy about her beauty, her mystery, her supposed double life. The irony was that Elizabeth Short had wanted to be noticed. And now she was, though for reasons no one would envy. The public devoured every scrap of rumour. Did she live a secret life as a call girl? Was she connected to organised crime? Was she caught in some Hollywood scandal hushed up by powerful men? Each theory was treated like gospel for a week, only to be replaced by the next. The truth was secondary to the thrill of speculation. Coffee counters buzzed with debate, barbershops swapped theories with more certainty than the police, and school children whispered the story as if it were a ghost tale. Detectives, for their part, began to realize they were no longer the authors of this narrative. They had become supporting characters in a drama written by the press and performed for the public. Each leak, intentional or accidental, became another act in the ongoing show. When the LAPD chased a suspect, it was headline news. When they released him, it was page 6. The cycle repeated until no one remembered which names were still relevant and which had been cleared months ago. And then there were the letters. Each new envelope claiming to be from the killer guaranteed another week of headlines. The handwriting was neat, the taunts theatrical, and the contents always just tantalizing enough to keep the press frothing. Were they authentic? Maybe. Probably not. But in a city where illusion pays better than honesty, authenticity was beside the point. The Black Dahlia had stopped being Elizabeth Short. She was now a brand, a symbol, a shorthand for mystery and tragedy. Her face stared from every paper, her name was repeated on every street corner, and yet the woman behind it all grew fainter with each retelling. She became less a person and more a story, one that the city seemed unwilling to let end. Los Angeles had perfected the art of distraction long before this case. It was a town that could turn bankruptcies into triumphs, scandals into premieres, and broken dreams into cautionary tales. The Black Dahlia fit neatly into this machinery. The city didn't just report her story, it consumed her, repackaged her, and sold her back to herself. By the summer, the investigation had stalled. Leads dried up, suspects blurred together, and the case began its long slide into the cold. But for the public, it didn't matter. The myth was already stronger than the truth. And in Hollywood, myths never die. They just wait for their next revival. By the end of 47, the file had weight, and not the useful kind. Leads had been chased in circles until they wore grooves in the floor. Suspects multiplied. Statements contradicted statements, and the city's patience thinned to tracing paper. Officially, the investigation was ongoing. Unofficially, detectives learned to say that word with the tone people reserve for stalled buses and broken elevators. The machine kept moving because machines don't know how to stop. Interviews were typed, photos logged, tips stamped and filed. The morgue had already done its arithmetic. The precinct was left with long division. Every week delivered a new almost. The witness who nearly remembered, the suspect who nearly fit, the timeline that nearly held. Almost is the most exhausting word in police work. Inside the department there were two camps. The optimists, who believed one more knock on one more door would break the thing open, and the realists, who had read enough case history to know that some knots tighten when you pull. The optimists carried extra pencils, The realists carried aspirin. Then came the whispers, the kind that travel along hallways and never sign their names. Missteps at the scene. Evidence handled with 1940s enthusiasm rather than science. Rivalries between officers. A reporter with better access to a trash bin than a rookie had to a file. The case had grown too famous to be clean. When too many people want to be near a story, the story bruises. By 49, the mood had settled into something like resignation. There were still raids at midnight and statements taken at dawn, but the rhythm had flattened. People moved on, as people do, and the city found other headlines. The file stayed, a stubborn monument to what hadn't happened. In 1950, a new rumour sprouted legs. A doctor with a house that looked like a set from a fever dream. Private lives examined, telephones listened to, conversations captured under the hum of hidden hardware. If you wanted a noir subplot, you couldn't have written it better. There were lines on tape that made men in suits stare at their shoes. There were memos that suggest someone somewhere believed a circle had been closed. And there were decisions, quiet, careful decisions, that did not end with handcuffs. Depending on who you ask, this was prudence, incompetence, or protection. In Los Angeles, those three wear the same hat. Files went missing the way socks do, not loudly, but with measurable impact. A box mislaid. A transcript not where it should be. A note that refers to a note no one can find. Bureaucracy is excellent at losing things it cannot delete. Years later, people with strong opinions would point at those gaps and write the word cover-up in capital letters. People with calmer hearts would shrug and say, records drown in time. Both parties could be right. Through the 1950s, the case cooled from headline to cautionary tale. Detectives transferred, retired, or learned to speak of it the way soldiers speak of weather. Inevitable and personal, but not something you can argue down. The public, bored with not knowing, adopted the posture of expertise. Everyone had a theory. No one had proof. The city returned to its primary occupation, selling tomorrows, no indictments, no trial, no verdict to fold and place into a scrapbook. Just a name, a date, a city that flinched and then pretended it hadn't. Cold cases are not cold because no one cares. They're cold because care without leverage turns to ice. By the close of the decade, the investigation hadn't ended so much as evaporated, leaving behind that faint mineral trace you notice only when the sun hits it. Something was here once. The 1960s taught Los Angeles to be nostalgic about itself. Neon that hadn't been paid for in years still glowed in memory. The old streetcars came back as postcards. Noir became a style rather than a weather report. The Black Dahlia slipped easily into that cabinet of curiosities. If a city needs a ghost, it picks one with good bone structure. True crime magazines kept the embers warm, lurid covers, confident captions, photographs cropped for mystery. The facts lost their edges and grew into archetype. She became the eternal ingenue, he the faceless predator, the city a chorus of blind witnesses. The case moved from police blotter to folklore, where evidence is optional and atmosphere is king. By the 70s, reruns of the 40s were fashionable. Private eyes with good jaws walked back into paperback. Trench coats returned to wardrobes that didn't need them. The Dahlia case profited from that climate. Each decade adds a layer. By then, the story had several, none of them exactly wrong and none of them able to breathe. In 1987, a novelist picked up the file, not the literal one, the cultural one, and wrote it the way literature does when it wants to reveal truth and is not obligated to prove it. He reimagined the city in chiaroscuro and planted the case at its heart like a thorn. Readers inhaled it. You could argue that a book did more to cement the legend than 1,000 clippings. Fiction, when it finds the right frequency, stabilizes a myth the way sugar stabilizes a meringue. The 1990s delivered two accelerants: the long tail of cable television and the short fuse of the early internet. Documentaries circled the subject with solemn narration and tasteful shadows. Late-night programs practiced a tone that could sell mattresses and murder in the same hour. Online forums, small, passionate, immune to sleep, turned Unsolved into hobby. Maps were drawn. Suspects were spreadsheeted. People argued politely until they didn't. Across those decades, Elizabeth herself drifted further from reach. Not the face that stayed. Soft focus, high contrast, pinned like a brooch to the word mystery. The person blurred. What she liked, feared, wanted. Those details became props for whatever theory needed them. The miracle of a myth is that it can stretch to cover anything. The tragedy is that it always covers someone. Films borrowed the title, sometimes the mood, sometimes less. Television borrowed the aesthetics. Venetian blinds at noon, shoes on linoleum, cigarettes that never ash. The case became a kit you could buy to decorate a story. Producers understand inventory. So do ghosts. By the 1990s, you could live in Los Angeles for years and never meet someone who knew what actually happened in January of 1947. You could, however, meet dozens who could deliver a perfect monologue about how it felt. In a town built on feeling true, that counts as expertise. Myth is what a city builds when time refuses to deliver. The Dahlia story, no longer a case, hardly a history, now functioned as set dressing for any conversation about Hollywood's shadow self. And like all well-made sets, it was convincing from the audience and flimsy from the wings. The 2000s arrived with a familiar promise. Technology would complete what tenacity could not. DNA would speak, archives would open, computers would knit together scraps that paper had kept apart. Into that optimism walked a former detective with a family connection sharp enough to cut. He reopened the case in his own living room and found, in the boxes and margins of an extraordinary life, a suspect with a surgeon's hands and a complicated address book. The thesis was explosive, the evidence intricate, the reception polarized. Some readers found closure in the geometry, others found a son arguing with a ghost. In any case, the city had a new edition of its favorite story. The decade added smaller comets to the sky. Private researchers with patience, journalists with access, podcasters discovering how to shape suspense with headphones. Old suspects were reheated, new ones plated and served. A nightclub owner's name resurfaced with the reliability of a buoy. A physician with a past walked back on stage. Letters were re-examined. Stamps weighed like omens. Photographs inspected the way tea leaves are. The 2010s made room for long-form obsession. Podcasts luxuriated in the slow drip of cliffhangers. Streaming found that unsolved pairs well with autoplay. Over time, the case became not just content, but infrastructure. People met in comment sections. Archive rooms took on the air of chapels. You could chart the city by its fixations, and this one had its own weather system. Then the 2020s added fresh oxygen. A new book proposed the shadow of this case might stretch across state lines. That another young woman, murdered years earlier in another city, could share not just a fate, but a thread. The claim rested on overlooked files, interviews rediscovered, artifacts that had sat in plain sight, because plain sight is an excellent disguise. Near the end of a long life, the woman who discovered the body finally said more than she once had. Not because she had changed, but because no one had asked the right follow-up. Her recollections didn't solve the case, they sharpened the outline. Meanwhile, attention rotated toward a doctor whose name had once been a footnote, and now demanded promotion. The biography came with aliases and blurred edges, which is another way of saying it fit neatly on a shelf already crowded with convenient men. Online, timelines inhaled the new data and exhaled confidence. Offline, archivists did what they always do: checked, cross checked, found that the past is as messy as the present, and twice as stubborn. Through it all, the old gravity reasserted itself. Media debated with careful certainty, then careful doubt, then a fresh certainty that contradicted the first and felt just as good. Articles insisted this was the breakthrough and then admitted, gently, that it wasn't. The city listened, nodded, and kept the myth polished. What the new leads proved, if anything, was that the case still works. It still generates narrative, employment, purpose. It still turns strangers into collaborators and skeptics into subscribers. It still keeps a young woman's name in the air, though not always her voice. In the 2020s, as in 1947, Los Angeles remains an efficient machine for manufacturing belief. The truth is welcome, provided it arrives on cue. No definitive solution, no courtroom, no stamp that says closed. Just another shelf of well-argued possibilities, placed carefully beside the older ones. The way museums arrange their most popular exhibits, with good lighting and better captions. What remains after decades of theories and a small mountain of paper is ordinary and unbearable, an unsolved murder. The city has had time to rename it, monetize it, and dress it for every era's taste, but the center hasn't moved. A young woman was alive and then she wasn't, and the distance between those two facts has never been bridged by proof. People ask, insistently, whether it can still be solved. The honest answer is that some cases close late. Paper resurfaces. A confession travels across a bed rail. A mislabeled envelope appears where no one thought to look. The other honest answer is that time is a vandal. It erases, smudges, edits. Evidence decomposes faster than conviction. Witnesses die. Memory curates. There is, too, the matter of appetite. Cities keep certain mysteries because they serve a civic function. This one explains nothing and everything. Why Hollywood feels haunted at noon. Why glamour reads as a warning label if you squint. Why the distance between what we sell and what we are can be measured in headlines. The case sits there, a mirror that flattens no one. And we keep it polished because it reflects well on our fascination with darkness. Calling it a riddle flatters us. Riddles have answers. This has only better questions. Who had the skill? Who had the time? Who wanted the city to watch? Which mistakes were accidents? And which were invitations? And beneath those, the smaller, more important questions we rarely ask because they do not feel cinematic. Who did she hope to be on that last ordinary morning? Who would have missed her if the papers had never discovered her name? In the end, the Black Dahlia is two stories stitched together. The life of Elizabeth Short and the legend built on top of it. One deserves tenderness, the other demands skepticism. If you listen closely, you can hear them arguing. The legend prefers neat arcs and meaningful motifs. The life reminds us that most days are errands, and most choices are made with incomplete information and too little sleep. Will it ever be solved? Possibly. The odds aren't generous, but neither are they zero. What is certain is that the city will keep the lights on for it. New books will arrive. Documentaries will murmur in dark rooms. Someone will find a photograph and see, at the edge, a clue the last generation missed. Perhaps it will be nothing. Perhaps it will be the door. Until then, the story remains where it has lived for nearly 80 years, between the lines, between a lobby where someone waited and a field where the wind will not forget, between the myth that sells and the name that matters, between our appetite for answers and our habit of mistaking performance for truth. And if there is a lesson, it is only this. Remember the person before the nickname. Everything else is stagecraft. And that sleepless rabble is where the trail fades into silence. No neat ending, no satisfying reveal, just a mystery that Los Angeles refuses to bury. The Black Dahlia remains unsolved, and maybe that's the point. Hollywood has always preferred a cliffhanger. If you've stayed awake this long, congratulations. You've survived both the LAPD's paperwork and my voice. Now it's your turn. Tell us where you're listening from. Drop your city in the comments because we want to know how far this story has traveled. And if you enjoyed drifting through this noir nightmare with us, you know the drill. Like, subscribe, and keep the lights low. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to True Crime Sleep Story. The Black Dahlia, Hollywood's darkest mystery. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, in Hollywood, not every dream ends with credits.